My name is Archie D. Rodgers, Jr., and I was born in Greenville, South Carolina. Lived there with my mother and father as school teachers until age 4, when I moved to Sumter, South Carolina, which was my father and my grandfather's and grandmother's home, where my father was raised. And when I got to the 8th grade, in the days even that soon, of course, everybody did some work. And I had to apply for a job at the drugstore, and they didn't think I was old enough. But anyhow, one of the boys goofed up one day, and the man called me and said, "I need somebody to go to work today." I said, "I will be there." So that was the beginning of my career at the drugstore. There were only 11 grades in school at that time, so that was put me in the 8th grade. I did anything that the drugstore required to do, but mainly what I want to get over is the fact that I can recall the cost of some of the items that we had in the drugstore. A lady would come in every morning and bring a box of sandwiches that she made at home. She delivered sandwiches all over town. You could get a chicken salad sandwich, a pimento cheese sandwich, or a ham sandwich made with white square type bread for the sum of 10 cents. And then she made a club sandwich, which had 3 slices of bread, but she cut that in half, and it would have more, of course, on it. That was 15 cents. Now, in those days, that was a fantastic price. We had about 6 tables on the inside of the drugstore, and in the middle of the street in front of the drugstore was parking spaces which cars would pull in and park side by side, and the ladies would come and blow the horn, and I would run and jump on the fender and find out what they wanted to buy. Well, starting off as well as I can remember, you got a double dip of ice cream for the children for a nickel. 2 dips. Of course, we had churns and stuff on the inside. You got a saucer of ice cream for the adults if they wanted that, for a dime. A Coke, which was the favorite deal, of course, for the ladies. They would come down and generally buy a package of crackers, which was a nickel for 4, and Coke was a 6-ounce fountain Coke made inside the drugstore, and of course you carried it out and you put the straw in it, and the ladies would come there morning and afternoon to have their little snack. And so that was taking care of that. Also, the drugstore part of our store was filled with patent medicine. We did not have a pharmacist, so we carried all kinds of patent medicine, cough syrup, and you just name it. As I recall, at that time you could get a small box of Bayer or St. Joseph aspirin in a little tin container that had 12 tablets. That would cost you 10 cents. You could buy a box of Luden's cough drops or Smith Brothers cough drops, and they were a nickel, and they would have probably 10 or 12 cough drops in it. A pack of Lucky Strike or Chesterfield cigarettes, which was probably the best known brand at that time, sold for 15 cents. Now this was before the time when the state government decided that they wanted to put on a sales tax so they could get 1 cent more on whatever you sold them. So very shortly after I started to work, if the ladies wanted a 6-ounce Coke, it would be 6 cents, 1 cent for the tax. The sandwiches went up to 11 or 12, and everything else just to mess things up, and the governor had more money to spend on the state. Well, we had, it was such a tight time with money during that time that little bags of tobacco with probably about 4 inches high and probably a half an inch by a half an inch when they were packed with tobacco, you could get that bag for 5, 6, or 8 cents according to whatever the boss was pushing at that time. And you could carry that bag of tobacco and you would get a package of paper and you could roll your own cigarettes, which is a fascinating thing. I never took up the habit. Everybody in the drugstore, because they were there, available, and if the boss wasn't there, they learned to smoke cigarettes. I was Scotch. My grandmother was very Scotch. And so one of them says, well, Red, why don't you pick up smoking? The cigarettes are free. I said, no, they are not free. They cost you 2 or 3 hand rolled, just laying on the counter, Target or something, cigarettes for you to smoke for a penny. And of course, if you got the 20 cigarettes in the regular paper package, well, that would be 15 cents, which went on up when they raised the taxes on the thing. We did quite a bit of business. We were between my daddy's dry cleaners on one side and the grocery store on the other side. Children would think it was a great deal if they could come in with 1 cent and get a jawbreaker or 1 or 2 sticks of gum for a penny. But that, you didn't get pennies thrown at you every morning. You had to do some work. I'll go to the grocery store next. When Mother and Daddy would go out of town, I would have to have lunch after I got out from school. I got off from school at 2 something. I went to work at the drugstore at 3, and I worked till 7. And on the weekends, I worked all day long. The going wage at that time for the younger guys was 10 cents an hour. Now, if you were one of the adults in there, these guys were maybe high school dropouts or hadn't made it all the way through college, but came back looking for a job and they couldn't find anything else. They would get 15 cents an hour. But then if you compared that with the wages that my father-in-law paid for hands on the farm, they would go to work at daylight in the morning and work till dark, and they drew 50 cents a week. That was from Monday morning through Saturday, and they generally would get off at 12 o'clock or something on Saturday. But now that's a lot of hours to work for 50 cents, so I felt I was doing all right as a teenager to do that. Well, when they would go off, they would give me a dime to go to the grocery store and get something to eat. At that time, the best crackers that you could get was National Biscuit Company. They were processed in boxes about 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 that would come, and you would open the front of those and put them in a container in the grocery store, and they had little glass covers that when somebody came in and decided what crackers they wanted and how many, you would politely pull the little knob open and you would reach in there and take out the number of crackers. The one that I loved was a high-priced cracker, cost you 1 cent for something like a vanilla wafer bottom covered with chocolate and marshmallow on the top. Now that was the hoi polloi as far as I was concerned. You could get a great big soda cracker, probably 2 for a penny, and for school children there was probably a box that was smaller than the average saltine cracker that we have today, and probably 15 or 20 in a box that were a nickel. I would go to the over and go in the grocery store, and I would buy me one of those school children boxes of saltines for a nickel, and of all things, the can of sardines that you look at in the store now that probably are $1 cost a nickel. That was when I first started off. That was high living. If you got a box of crackers and a can full of sardines, it would fill you up and you would last till you had supper time. Normally, if Mother and Daddy were there was a lady ran a boarding house right behind our dry cleaners there, and her brother supplied her with all of the farm products that you would raise. So it was just like her walking out in the yard and gathering beans and tomatoes and corn or anything like that. He would come in with his truck every morning with this fresh stuff, and she had help there. And as I recall, it was first adults ate for 20 cents and children ate for a dime. Same thing that I paid for the small crackers. But it eventually ended up, by the time I graduated from school, it was 25 cents. They didn't, I don't know how they got by not paying a tax on that. All right, that's all I can think about for the grocery store. Of course, you could probably get a large can of pork and beans for a dime, and string beans or corn cut like you see to fix for a regular dinner would certainly be no more than 15 cents. If it did, the housewife thought they were stealing her money for the groceries. Daddy ran the dry cleaners there for years, and I worked there until 1957 when I moved to Georgetown and got the present job that I have. I can't remember what the pressers, people that actually ironed the clothes, drew, but in those days, a man's suit with a pair of pants and a coat would be 50 cents. A lady's full dress, now this was the dry cleaning, a lady's full dress would be 50 cents. A lady's blouse or a lady's skirt or a lady's sweater would be 25 cents. Try that on your local dry cleaner and see what you get. But the price was set mostly, I guess, by the different people that ran the dry cleaners. And anyhow, Daddy made a living and fed us all on those kind of prices. Now, we did have a jerk come around later on who was one of the younger generation, and he would love to wait till Easter, which was the big day for dry cleaners. Everybody wanted to go with a clean dress suit and so forth. He would do 3 suits for $1, cash and carry, to the store, not delivered. Or 3 ladies' dresses, cash and carry, you bring them in and you come and pick them up. And so everybody was able to maintain their dry cleaning needs without spending a whale of a lot of money. And if you had an overcoat or a lady's coat cleaned, an overcoat, a man's overcoat, a long, full length, would cost you 50 cents. And of course, if a lady had a coat with a fur collar or something on it, I can't remember the prices on all of them, but they were all ran in the same range. Now, going back and running into some of the accessories, of course, whenever you were a young man, you would always want to be dating. And of course, when you date, there wasn't anything in a small town to do. The streets closed up at 9 o'clock, and you didn't find anybody but a policeman walking the car about. And we had a real good man there that ran 2 of the 3 movie houses. There was one of them was just, the movie was 10 cents all the time, shoot 'em up, the serials that you would see, and of course, eyes and ears of the world newscast would come on, so you'd always, that beat the news, because that was, everybody, that was before radios. And so the other 2 places seemed to me like he was charging 10 cents for high school students and 15 cents for adults. Well, this guy had a couple of children that were in school, and when the state come along and said, you're gonna have to raise the price of that 10 cents to whatever it was, and he sat around and he said, no, I'm not gonna raise the price on these school children. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll reduce it to 9 cents, and you won't get that penny tax, and my children will get to see the movie at either one of the 2 places. One of them was a kind of trashy place that showed more shoot-'em-ups, but the other one was one that would show people like Gone with the Wind or The Thin Man, popular authors, and they would run a good film, would maybe run 3 or 4 days. But, and in those days, if you went to the movie, you were living it up. A box of popcorn, which was just a little bit bigger than the Cracker Jack box that you buy now that's dipped in caramel, that box of popcorn was the only size that they sold, and it was popped right there in the lobby, and it sold for a nickel. So you could afford to, if you had a little allowance, most children would get 25 cents a week allowance, and then it's according to how you wanted to blow it as to what you would do. But everything, I recall there was a meat shop down below my dad's dry cleaners, and about once every 2 weeks my mother would call me. She was the clerk at the counter at the front. She said, Archie D, I want you to go down and tell the butcher that I want a soup bone. Well, the first time I says, well, what are you gonna give me? I'm not gonna give you anything. He cuts the meat up and leaves the soup bones. Well, he puts them in a box, and whatever Mama wanted the soup bone, she would send the children in, and you got a soup bone with whatever meat was left on it, but would be enough like a ham hock, like you would trim a ham here. You would always leave ham on it, you know, to have a pot of peas or something. That was free. I don't remember what the steaks, we didn't eat very much steaks, I'll tell you. Back to another thing that I recall, once in the fall, Daddy would take me particularly to the store that handled boys' clothes, and they had a sweater that it must have made 3/4 of an inch thick, manufactured, knit by Rugby, R-U-G-B-Y. And it had a collar on some of them, and some of them had a V-neck. And I don't recall what they were, but you would always get a pair of high-top shoes. Now that would be the shoes that you would wear to school and work in the yard and any place else. But now if you wanted to live it up, there was a pair of shoes called Friendly Fire, which was a regular artist professional shoe for the sum of $5. Now that was a pair of black shoes that you polished and that you wore to your church. And I don't have any idea what the pants in church were, but in comparison, they were real good. On the weekend, we had a little hole in the wall on Front Street, right next to a tin stand, which was a separate building, which one of the older men ran as a hot dog and hamburger stand. And of course, you didn't get into it. It had benches on the outside, and you would walk up there and sit on the bench, and you would order a hot dog with all the onions and all on it was a nickel. A hamburger was 10 cents, and I mean it wasn't a small hamburger. It filled the bun like we still get today. And this man had about 5 or 6 children. He never worried about help, because when they got out of school, they came and worked in that store until Papa closed the store. Right next to that was a shoe stand. This colored fella ran a shoe stand parlor. I guess he had 6 seats that you would crawl up on and put your feet up on the stand to have the boy come and shine your shoes. Well, he would shine your shoes to a glisten. I don't care how bad the leather was beat up. It seemed that the polish that they put on in those days would always give you a church look to go to church on weekend. I never got to go in there. I had a shoebox at home with a can of polish, and I polished the family's shoes at home. But it would be a nickel, and of course he would have people bring in, and ladies would bring their slippers in. And on the weekend, he boiled peanuts with an old kerosene or gas stove that had a special built by a company, and you would take the green peanuts and separate them and put them in there, and he knew how long to parch them. And if you could walk by that stand and you love parched peanuts, you couldn't stand the odor. You would quit breathing when you walked by there, particularly on Saturday. He would always sell one right after the other of those things, because everybody had a nickel. A nickel was like a penny, and a penny, I guess a penny was like a nickel. But and this guy had his children, and they would operate the thing. And it's Friday and Saturday, baseball games, football games and stuff, people would go by there and buy bagged peanuts for a nickel and put them in there. And in the summertime, you could get a bag full of salty boiled peanuts for a nickel. And now I think the last time I looked, they're 25 or 50 cents for a bag, for the same size identical bag. In those days, if you lived in the country and you had a death in the area, you never contacted a mortuary. there was always somebody in the neighborhood that would do this for you. They would take the door off of its hinges and put it on 2 sawhorses, and the ladies would, man or woman, they would dress them, shave them, fix them up in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and that was a stiffening board until the guy, whoever was the carpenter, which in my granddaddy's area, he was a horseshoer and a cobbler and a jack of all trades. As soon as he heard that somebody needed a coffin, he knew everybody in the community. He would just go out to his shed, and he had the tools, not electricity, but hand saws, hammers, nails, lathes and stuff. And he would build a coffin, put it in his wagon, and take that coffin as soon as he could get there over to the house, and they would take the body up and put it in. And of course, as the ladies decided, well, we don't like that just cold death feeling in that wooden casket, they decided to start putting cloth and stuff in and, you know, razzing it up. But that was just part of the neighborhood. I don't know how they ever collected. I know I went one time with my granddad at the gym, and he carried a bunch of corn there on the cob. Well, the guy was running corn that day, and they had oak baskets that were wooden, that were half a gallon size, and that's what they would put underneath the spout when the corn came out. Well, being a kid, I watched the man that day very carefully. Granddaddy went off and was talking to somebody. When the man got through, he snatched the last one off full, poured it in Granddaddy's bag, and he grabbed a container for himself and put it underneath the spout, and the corn kept on falling, you know. And I stood there and I said, well, this ain't right. He's cheating Granddaddy out of thing. When Granddaddy came back, I went over there, I said, Granddaddy, that man took a bucket of your corn when it came out of the truck. He said, son, that's the way we do business. He gets a bucket, and that's his pay. It's according to how many buckets you get as to how much he gets. And everything, you know, was done, you bartered. You would go, you need help, you'd go next door to the home where the men had a bunch of children, and if you had something to pick or something like that, you'd say, Wednesday I'm gonna be picking cotton, or Wednesday we're gonna be gathering vegetables. Well, they would gather up half of the dozen of the children, which wasn't anything in those times. Families were rather large, and those children would come over there, and when they got through, Daddy smiled and said, go crawl back in the wagon. But it was a trade thing. He got his beans and stuff picked, and whenever time come to pick the others, that was what they did. Lamps. When I first went to church at my grandfather's house, they had no electricity. They had lamps hanging down from the ceiling of the churches. And of course, some man would come around, and if you were having services on Wednesday night or Sunday night, he would pull the lamp down and get his matches out, and he would light the oil lamp and then raise it. And that furnished light all over the church. So, and a lot of homes, it was years before my granddaddy ever had electricity, when the county came down to what they call the county line road and ran the line, the electric line. Up until that time, they never had electricity. In fact, Grandmama didn't like it, but it was handy. Also, one Sunday we were out at my grandmother's, and it started hailing. Hail was falling big as a 50-cent piece. Grandmother got up over that front porch, because we were all sitting on the porch about this side. She says, "Archie D, come on in the house." Well, I went in there. She got a bucket of some sort, milk pail or something. She said, "Here, take this and go out there underneath that pine tree, and on that straw that's falling down there, pick up all the ice of hail that you can and fill this bucket and bring it back quick." Well, I run out there. I had no earthly idea what was going to happen. I went out there and I gathered the thing up, and when I got back to the kitchen, she already had her bucket and had fixed up a churn of vanilla mixture to churn a churn of ice cream. Now today, people say, "You gotta be crazy." But the Iceman never came around there until years later, and then you had to, at least every other day, you had to get 25 or 50 pounds, you know, and you could then, up until that time, you canned everything, beans, peas, and everything like that. You canned it, because that was the only way to save it. But just think, whenever she got ready to have supper, she'd say, "Archie D, go out to the shed there and bring me a gallon of tomatoes." And I would go out there, and here on this side of the shelf would be gallons of tomatoes, which were, you could either fix the tomatoes or make tomato soup. There was corn that had been cut off the cob, preheated to keep it from going bad. Sweet potatoes, you just left the sweet potatoes down there, and when they all got to where they started rotting, and you throw them out of the straw. But there was always economy. During the Depression now, I lived in the city. Daddy, whenever he started working with the dry cleaners, we lived on the county line. There was a line drawn from the courthouse the same distance around Sumter. The line ran in the back end of my yard, and our house was, we had a long lot. And everybody didn't have an automobile. When you got ready to go to school, you walked to the corner because it was a dirt road. Then the sidewalk ran about 8 or 10 blocks to town. You either had skates, there was no skateboards, you had skates, or you hoofed it. If it was raining and you were lucky and your parent had a car, they would gather up the 2 or 3 kids here and to fill up the back of the car and drive to school and, of course, dump you out. That was one sign. And you would have a lot of people come to your door and say, "Could you give me something to eat? I'll rake your yard. Could you give me something to eat? I'll hoe your vegetables. I'll paint your house." And there was a lot of trade. Very seldom, and there was anything that you could trade. As my wife says, her father would send the 5 or 6 girls over to do work, and she said, "You know, he didn't even think to thank me after I worked all day out in the hot sun, because whenever it come time for us to help them, we helped them. They came over and helped us." So it was always that. And of course, there would always be a dressmaker, a lady who you could, in the neighborhood, you could take anything to. and I can guarantee you she could fix it if you had torn it, or if it had a rip in it or a seam that came loose. This person was just a gifted type person who could change the lengths of your pants and your skirts, and if you gain weight, you had to have it let out, or if you were lucky according to today's fashion, you know, and lost weight, well, jeepers, the last time Cornelia took a bunch out to have it done, seemed to me like it was, when she got through, she carried about 4 or 5 things like that. It seemed to me like it was $25 or $30. And that was the going price. And everybody didn't have a job. A lot of times boys and girls would go all the way through high school, and I was lucky. I had one sister who was a year older than me, and Daddy saved up enough money, and by borrowing some that I had worked and put in a little savings account, he had enough to pay for the 4 years that she went to Greenville Women's College. But the second year, I was 1 year younger than she was. When that time come along, I was courting heavy, and I got married as soon as I got out of high school. And I went to work for the dry cleaners. I'd go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'd work till 6 o'clock that afternoon with an hour off for lunch. I'd get off from work at the dry cleaners, go home, the wife would have supper. I'd get dressed and cleaned up, and I'd go back to the drugstore, and I would start a shift at 7 o'clock at the drugstore. And you only got paid from 7 till 11. But the theater never got out right at 11. And I don't know how he ever got by with it, because we boys were just crazy enough to do it. I have worked the majority of the time from 11 till 11:30 or 11:45 before we could ever serve the sandwiches and the drinks and the ice cream to the late theater crowd. And you say, he didn't thank us for that. You just got 40 cents for the 4 hours. But between the 4 and the ones that I worked at for the dry cleaners, we had enough money. We had a little teeny house that we rented for $10 a month. Across the front of it was a square area for the living room, and the other square over on this side was the bedroom. The back of the bedroom had the bath on the corner, and the long back part had the dinette suite and the kitchen stove and stuff in there. And before the Depression was over, there was an old bachelor who I rented from. He would know the day I got $1 raise, I don't know who would tell him, my rent would automatically go up in a week. I paid $10 for a while, I paid $11 for a while, I paid $12 for a while. And when it got to 15, now I had to make a little over $15. I had 2 friends who were in the National Guards, and they came by the house, and one of them was older and had a car. Said, "Red, come on out." Well, we already had 1 child, and washed clothes. Have you ever washed baby clothes in the bathtub? I mean from scratch. And you had a line out there that no machine. You were lucky if you had the old Sears and Roebuck grinder to run them through. You hung them all on the outside, when you got through, we were lucky. We had a colored girl that came in and would cook dinner and supper and tend to the children, and I've forgotten what we paid her, but she never complained about what she was getting. And we worked as long as she lived there and until she moved, and she said, I sure hope that where I'm moving, I can get a job like this. Now, people wondered how you did, but now you didn't eat steak. If we had steak once every 2 or 3 weeks, it would be good. But now, when we went to the country, Mom-in-law would go out to the ham. Have you ever seen hams hanging in the outside? She'd take that old butcher knife and you could whistle across that thing, and she'd whack a piece of ham off of it. You wrap that one up and give it to this daughter. You whack a piece of this ham off. There were 3 girls, about 2 years apart, and she would do that until the ham run out. And so we felt like we always had ham. We did not waste it. You cooked 2 slices, and that was ham. And we always had a garden out there. We'd go out and work it. The wife would work it. She was raised in the country, and so she knew how to do that. And we would actually can stuff in a small fashion. But everybody, I had one couple that I know graduated in 31. I graduated in 32. He and his wife, he had an old van of some sort that he loaded stuff. I guess he would go to the big grocery store warehouse and load that thing full of stuff that he could sell, and he would drive around through the country. And he promised his wife that every weekend they would go out. Well, I couldn't afford to join the Moose or the Elks, but they were members of the Elks Club. I have no idea what it cost, but they would go to the dances. And he said, I owe it to my family. Well, when he got 2 or 3 children, he decided he couldn't keep on doing that. But it was all, you would keep, we had a churn, and we had a 2-hole refrigerator which would hold a block, half of it would hold a chunk of ice like this. But when you had ice, you had a man to come and bring it. Well, it just so happened that the 2 guys worked on the Iceman's truck, dadgummit, were in my sister's grade. And they didn't think anything about opening that refrigerator, and they wouldn't ask if there was a biscuit there. They'd reach in and pick that biscuit up and stick it in their mouth and walk out without a pea turkey or thank you. And of course, we never throwed bread away. You baked a pan of biscuits, particularly in the country. My mother-in-law would make a pan of biscuits like this about twice a day, because you didn't buy loaf bread. And so you made sandwiches. You'd bake a loaf of bread in a pan that you had big enough to make home bread, and everything just worked out fine. Except before I got a chance to buy a place, the old gentleman called me in, and I was making about $16 a week, and he says, Red, how would you like to buy that place? I looked at him and I said, Mr. Ard, what would I use to pay you? I don't make a large sum of money. He said, well, I'll tell you what I do. You've been a good runner. I've forgotten how many years I rented, probably 8 or 10. He said, I'll sell you that place if you've got $1,000 cash that you can lay in my hand. I looked at him. I said, I don't have $100. Can't you go to the bank and borrow it? I said, we don't borrow. If we buy, we got the money in your pocket. And then you can go buy. Live it up. If you ended up buying something and spending your last penny, you knew that when Saturday come, you would get the same amount of money. And the reason I say something about the National Guards, when these boys picked me up, I went out to the armory, and this first sergeant, armory was on the edge of something. They drilled for an hour and a half a week. They furnished you uniforms and all. Of course, you had to keep them clean and this, that, and that. So I asked him, I said, he said, boy, you want to get in the National Guards? Well, everybody that came out there, of course, wanted to get in the National Guard for their money. So I said, I got a question I want to ask. I was peculiar. He said, well, what's your problem, son? I said, how do you get from point A to point B when you go over to Fort Jackson and you're a soldier in that? He says, you go down and you ask the stable manager to let you take a mule out of the lot. I said, and if you take that mule out of the lot, you got to know how to saddle him and get on him. He said, yeah. I said, I'm a city boy. He looked at me and said, son, you're crazy. You can make $1 for an hour and a half, whistle to whistle, with the National Guard, and you're working for 10 cents an hour. And you work an hour and a half, and you get $1. I said, yeah, but a mule scares me to death, because I had been caught in my grandfather's lot, and he had a mixture of a horse and a mule. The horse was trained to pull the buggy, so my grandmother, that was the way she got around. He would hook the buggy up and park it by the door. She would get in the buggy, and off she would go, just like you'd go out and get in your car. And whenever she'd come back, she would drive the buggy back and hook it on the front doorstep, and he would come or have one of his helpers come and disconnect it. But that was the way. So after we came back from camp the next year, they left the mules at Fort Jackson. Well, I was a pretty sharp young lad. Well, I went out there again with the boys. He said, you back? I said, yeah. I said, all right, Sergeant. You left the mules at Fort Jackson, but when you go back to Fort Jackson, are you going to pick them mules up? Because I ain't getting in to ride or try to get killed by a mule. He says, we have 1.5 ton Chevrolet trucks that they would issue just enough of them for the bodies to fit in to go take them out. I said, I want to enlist. And I enlisted, and I'm telling you what, man, that $12 check, you drill once a week, 12 weeks, and you got a $12 check from the government. Oh, that was living in high cotton. I took that first check and endorsed that thing and give it to my wife. I said, here, honey, go live it up. First money that I ever had that I didn't want to put right in the pot along with the rest of it. Well, of course, as time passed by and I increased the rank that I had, I went from $1 to $1.15 and finally got up to a sergeant. And I think I made $1.50 there, and that was a fantastic wage for an hour. The closer it got to World War II, people began to leave Sumter and go to bigger places that had mills and one thing and another. So consequently, they had to pay a little bit more for wages in a small town to keep everybody from going off. And when I got commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1938, I thought I was living in high cotton. I'd forgotten what my salary was. But after I came down and was working down here for the Armory, we had a colonel, and everybody had to go listen to his lecture. And oh, he got carried away, a full colonel now. I don't know what he made, but considering what anybody else made, it was a fantastic sum of money. He said, oh, I love the National Guards and I would be in it. He said, even if I didn't make any money, we were all sitting in a row. One of the younger guys leaned down and said, Red, would you stay in the National Guards if you got it free? I said, I got in the National Guard to make money, and as of today, I'm still in the National Guards to make money. Nothing is free. But immediately after World War II, while I was gone, my wife, a guy, ran a junkyard, still runs a junkyard in Charleston. He got caught. He was buying iron and selling it to Japan, and he had every bit of the iron that he could get. He'd send out in the country and buy plowshares and this, that, and the other, and then bring it in, and he'd ship carloads of it to be shipped to Japan. Well, he got hard up. He spent all of his money on bringing it in, and he ended up, one time, he didn't have collateral, and he had people working for him. And so he advertised this country house. It's a farmhouse, 3 bedrooms, but it was a regular farmer had lived there. Anything that a farmer can live in, I could live in. And so he advertised this place for so much money. Well, I went around and I figured out how much I could take. I could clean my bank account down just so it would just be open. And my father-in-law was going to loan me about $200 or $300, and that would equal the cash amount that he needed. He was hurting because the wages were going to come due on Saturday, and he didn't have money to rattle his pocket. And I had that money, man, I had it out in 1s and 5s. I had a wad of money like this. And we went by the lawyer's office, and of course they took time to count it. He counted it out. As soon as he got it counted out, he told his lawyer, give me the paper to sign and I'll sign my name, I gotta go. And he says, you cheated me. I said, I don't have to buy your property, I'm still renting. That was all he said. He took off. Well, in the meantime, he got some money from someplace, and he sent his lawyer around, says, I'll give you $500 extra for that farmhouse that you just bought. And I hadn't moved in it. I said, Nathan, I am sorry, but I'm fixing that place up, and that's going to be my home. But when I went in, I had still some money that I had borrowed, and the wife was going to take so much out of my pay. I allotted her money. You would allot $50 or $100 to your wife. She'd never draw it, but it would come to her as a check to her bank. And so this guy got in his bind again, and he wanted something like $800. Well, my wife had saved money, just like everybody else. we had enough money to go to see her father and get $300 to make $800, and he had to have $800 payday. So we paid the last payment on it and got the house, and that's what I lived in until I moved down here. After all, everybody lived in a farmhouse. Now, I had running water in mine and a bathroom, but that was not there when that farmhouse was put in. So everybody, and when I came out of the service, of course, everything was booming, and or at least everybody made a fairly decent salary. But you always find out that when you get a raise, you better save a little bit of that, because you're going to end up needing it sooner or later. And as I say, even when I came down here and went by the Buick place, when I walked in there, I had a handful of money. And I said, I want to buy one of them cars sitting out there. He said, how you gonna pay for it? I said, tell me how much and I'll see if I buy. And he told me what it was, and I went and talked to the wife. I said, you think we can afford that? She said, yeah. I went back in and took about 15 minutes to count out the ones and the fives. But I charged something to Sears one time, and I found out in less than a year that they were going to almost pay, if I paid $100 and $500 or something, and I borrowed $200, I was going to pay them about $400 or $500 back. Man, I went down there and I took care of that. Now I have a courtesy card, and I get a bill from a courtesy card for anything. I get the bill at the end of the month. I pay for it. I don't buy it if I don't need it. But that's the problem. You think you need it, but I had 2 feet I could walk on, rode a bicycle many times, and it was about 1.5 miles to the dry cleaners from where my home was in Sumter. I have skated, I have ridden a bicycle, and during the rainy time, somebody from the plant would come and pick me up. Other than that, didn't worry me to get out. I wasn't proud. Pride was just before the fall.